So these jackets are beautiful.
Richard Ford has an eye for detail, sizing up the inventory at Franco Uomo, a menswear boutique in San Jose.
There's something traditional, but there's also something very contemporary about the color and the pattern. That's not your dad's jacket.
As Ford knows, when it comes to fashion, there's so much more than meets the eye. He shares that insight in the book Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History.
Dress codes are rules about what people can wear. So employers or schools or sometimes even the government might have rules or laws regulating the things that people can wear. But I also mean by dress codes the way we decode the meaning of clothing and attire, because clothing is communicating and it is signifying, social status, identity, social position.
A self-proclaimed clothes horse, Ford is a professor of civil rights and employment law at Stanford.
And a surprising number of legal disputes and litigation revolves around dress codes. Women suing their employers who require women and only women to wear makeup or high-heeled shoes. African Americans sue their employers over dress codes that prohibit certain hairstyles, dress codes that forbid certain types of clothing that religious traditions require people to wear, like head coverings.
And as Ford uncovers, it's a story as old as fashion itself. When did clothing go from just putting something on to fashion?
In the book, I talk about the birth of fashion in the late 1300s.
Before then, clothes were draped on the body. Think togas or robes. That's until
tailoring became widespread among elites. And that changed the nature of clothing and fashion. It made it much more expressive. It made it much more personal.
But not everyone was permitted to dress for success. So-called sumptuary laws kept royal subjects in their place, going back to the 1500s. Under Queen Elizabeth, you knew your place in society based on what you were able to wear and what you were wearing.
And this was true all over Europe. But in Tudor England, and especially under Queen Elizabeth I, there were what were called acts of apparel that regulated clothing according to social status, and they were quite detailed. Only a knight of the garter or higher in rank would be allowed to wear a certain type of silk or a certain color or a certain fabric, and there were gradations all the way down the social spectrum.
For centuries, all the sartorial advances were tailored to men, all the way up to the business suit.
It's practical, it's sensible. And that reflects the ideals of enlightened reason and also of industriousness, a new value at this period of time. And what's important about that moment in the 1700s, and some historians describe it as the great masculine renunciation. So it's the renunciation of all of the finery and what have you. But it is a masculine renunciation. To some extent, women's clothing perhaps becomes even more elaborate in opposition to this new streamlined male silhouette.
It would take another 120 years for a similar revolution in the female wardrobe.
The flappers, although I think from today's perspective, we tend to think of them as frivolous.
We think of them dancing in a nightclub.
Right.
Prohibition
jazz,
and yeah.
Exactly. Cocktails, Daisy Buchanan from The
Yeah.
Great Gatsby. But in fact, the flappers started off as working class women, racially diverse group of women, women who needed clothing to be practical and wanted to have some of the freedom of men.
The 20th century put fashion at the forefront of many social movements, from the zoot suit in the 1940s to the refined attire of the civil rights era.
If you go back in history, there were laws in the United States that prohibited Negroes and slaves from dressing above their condition. So when the civil rights protesters wore their Sunday best where they knew they would be confronted by racist mobs, that was part of the symbolism of the demand for dignity and the demand for respect.
That sense of fashion resonated with Ford's father,
He trained as a tailor when he was in college.
a Birmingham, Alabama native who used clothing to distinguish himself professionally.
So he would always examine suits. He would pick them up and he'd check to make sure that there was a floating, what's called a floating canvas. You'd pull between, and if it wasn't there, he'd go, no, not that one, that's glued together. And then when he found one like this that was very nice, Okay, maybe.
For men, suits remained the dominant dress code in offices for centuries. But from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, dressing down is now business as usual.
So the dress code has gone away in the workplace, and particularly around here in the Silicon Valley.
Right.
This is what you need to wear to work.
That includes everything from yoga pants to hoodies.
And it may seem like there's nothing to it, but the rejection of the business suit, the rejection of formal attire, that was a big deal in the early Silicon Valley tech companies, and they were pretty explicit about thinking that rejecting a formal dress code was a way of rejecting the uptight, lockstep, non-creative ethos of older corporate America.
Yeah.
Think outside the box.
Don't trust the guy in the suit.
Right, exactly.
This one piece of clothing doesn't just have one set of coded language or coded meaning.
Because so much depends on social context as well. It matters whether you're wearing it in the middle of the Silicon Valley or you're wearing it in the inner city.
Yeah.
All of those things change the meaning of clothing.
If we're this casual now, where are we in 50 years?
Right. Well, I imagine the casual trend is here to stay, but I talked to the creative director from Esquire, and he said, the new generation is wearing jackets and ties, and it's exactly as you suggested. My dad wears a sweatshirt and sneakers. And so I do see a new generation of young people who are dressing in a bit more of a refined manner.